Everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Why Talk Period, hosted by Swansea University's School of Sport and Exercise Sciences. Throughout the session, you're able to join in. We want this to be interactive, so ask us any questions that you've got. You'll see on your display screen what's highlighted in red. At any point during the presentation or during the discussion, if you click that Q&A button, you can type in any questions or comments that you have for us. You can choose to send that anonymously if you prefer. They'll come through to us, and during that part of the session, we'll try to answer as much as we can, as fully as we can. For those of you that are unfamiliar with Swansea University, we founded in 1920, so we're celebrating our 100th birthday this year, and it's obviously changed immensely in that time. We're now a dual campus university, with sport and exercise science being based on our Bay campus, which is in that bottom photo on your screen. The university has just under 18,000 students, of which around 15% are from overseas, obviously a large staff cohort across a range of services. In terms of sport and exercise science at Swansea University, our research centre within the school is the Applied Sports Technology, Exercise and Medicine group. We call it ASTEM. And it's really unique in that it's the only department in sport and exercise science in the UK that's located within the College of Engineering, which lends well to some of the research collaborations that we have. And our research activity is, broadly speaking, across three main areas. There's elite sports performance, exercise medicine and health, and sports ethics, integrity and governance. And it's these themes of research that influence who we collaborate with on a research level and how we apply the work that we are doing. It influences the Masters of Science by Research projects that we are able to offer and supervise at postgraduate level. And it informs the curriculum that we have on our undergraduate programs. So we offer a BSc Mathematics and Sport and Exercise Science joint degree. And we have our main undergraduate program, which is the BSc Sport and Exercise Science. So across those research themes, it influences our staff, our facilities, the modules that we offer, and the projects that we are able to provide. We've been away from our facilities for the last couple of months, obviously. We missed them immensely, but being on our new Bay campus at Swansea University, we've got some top-class teaching and research facilities that we miss very much. And in lending to performance, we've got the International Sports Village at Swansea University. That includes sports centre, indoor and outdoor athletics facilities, the Wales National Pool, and a really active athletic union within the Students' Union in the university, with a range of teams for men and women at various levels and all the support associated with that. And what you can see on your screen is just a snapshot of some of the partners that we collaborate with, whether that's on a research level, whether it's with industrial collaboration and commercialisation, who guide and influences our curriculum and what we're providing, and the staff that we have within the school, and who students can do placements with as well. And all of this work and the history that we have within the department enables us to be a UK top 15 department for sport and exercise science, according to the Times Good University Guide of 2020. Our research quality is ranked 9th in the UK, again, according to that Times Good University Guide 2020. And for graduate prospects, we're ranked 7th in the UK in the Guardian University League Table of 2020. And with the last assessment that was done, so the Destination of Leavers of Higher Education survey, 100% of our graduates were employed or within further study within 6 months of graduating. So, it's really good results off the back of the hard work and effort that's been invested in the school in the last few years. Now, this session is being recorded and will be circulated afterwards. But if you do want to stay in touch and contact us about the programme, about collaboration, about studies and the course that we offer, you can contact me directly via the information that's on your screen there. So without further ado, just introduce ourselves. So my name's Adam, and I'm manager for student recruitment and admissions for the School of Sport and Exercise Sciences. And we're joined today by Dr. Natalie Brown, who's going to deliver the session on why talk period. So hi Natalie, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Good, thanks. I was wondering if you could begin by just telling us a little bit about yourself and about your background.
Yeah, no problem at all. Thanks for having me today. So a little bit about myself. I currently work for the Welsh Institute of Performance Science. So that is actually a collaboration between Swansea University and Sport Wales. So I'm a research assistant now within that collaboration, but I've actually done all of my studies through Swansea University. So I started off doing my undergrad there. I then went straight on to do my master's in sports science before having a 2-year kind of working in industry. So I went and worked for Welsh Swimming as a performance scientist before returning back to Swansea Uni again to do my PhD, and have continued on straight from there as a research assistant now. Brilliant. So I can definitely say I've been through all of the Swansea University courses.
It's funny, it's quite common, you know, as Dylan Thomas said that Swansea's the graveyard of ambition and nobody ever leaves, but the truth is nobody wants to leave, do they?
No, I went away to work and I've ended up coming back. I did work up in Cardiff for a year, but I've come back to Swansea again, so now I'm here hopefully for a while.
Brilliant. Well, I'll hand over to you then to run through your session today, after which we'll have a discussion. We can answer some questions that will come in from myself and from the audience then.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you. So if I just share my screen. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that okay.
That's fine.
Brilliant. Thanks, Adam, for confirming that. So thanks for everyone who's joined today. So the topic today I've put is why talk in periods. So this is my area of research. So I'm looking predominantly into the impact of the menstrual cycle on training and performance. So to give you a bit of a flavour almost for maybe how I work in this area in sports sciences, one of the key aims for me is to support females to perform at their very best on any given day of their menstrual cycle. And I've put there whether that's in sport, whether that's in work and education or daily life. But today I'm going to predominantly focus around the sport and physical activity side of things. But it is also a consideration for when I am working with female athletes of how the menstrual cycle is affecting them day to day. Because if they're not feeling at their best in their daily life, they're certainly not going to be at their best training and competing. So some of what I'm going to talk to you about today, first of all, I am going to go through a little bit of I'm going to call it a menstrual cycle 101. So actually, what is the science behind the work that I'm doing? And then provide an example of actually some lived experiences, so of female athletes, and how I apply that scientific knowledge into a sporting setting. And I'm actually going to finish off by going through an example and just some of the key considerations I've had when working on this topic in a sports setting. So I'm just going to start off with, and this is actually what I always say when I'm presenting to coaches or female athletes, is females are really fortunate that they've actually got a menstrual cycle, because it's like having an extra vital sign. Just like you consider your pulse or your body temperature, having a regular period with only mild symptoms is actually a really good indicator of good underlying health. So if we've got any athletes in the first instance that maybe have irregular periods or very severe symptoms, it's actually a good extra checkpoint really for me working with those female athletes to see what's going on and see if there's any underlying conditions that we need to address, whether that's an energy deficiency or more on a medical condition. So just to get started with the menstrual cycle. So first of all, the menstrual cycle I always re-emphasize that it is a biological process. So there is this perception of it not being something we talk about, it being quite secretive, it not being something that we share, but it is actually a biological process that is aimed at reproduction. So just to go into that in a bit more detail of how the menstrual cycle works, you've got the cycle is a repeating pattern that's caused by fluctuations in sex hormones. And there's so many factors that can affect that and cause different variations. So whether that's stress, whether that's training, whether that's taking a contraceptive pill, there's loads of factors that might influence it that we need to consider. A typical cycle will last 21 to 35 days. So again, that's what we use as an indicator of a regular cycle when I'm working with female athletes. And we always characterize day one as being the first day of a period or the first day of bleeding. And this last point I've got there around girls usually start their periods around 12, but can be young as 8. Or on the flip side, if they haven't started by the time they're like 15, 16, then we'd maybe refer them to go and see a GP, because again, that could be a sign for us of those developing female athletes that there's something maybe not quite right. And that extra vital sign that females have got is really, really important for us to pick up on, which hasn't always been the case maybe within sports science, that a lot of research previously has been done around males. And so it's definitely been within more recent years that we've actually started to consider the female as an entity in its own, rather than being treated as small men, is some of the current research is suggesting. So what causes the menstrual cycle? And this is what I suppose is the basis for the work that I've completed. So we've got this science underpinning here of 4 different hormones that I've got there: follicle stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, estrogen, and progesterone. They fluctuate and interact between the brain and the reproductive system to cause different points within the menstrual cycle. So the main point there being ovulation in the middle. So you have this increase in estrogen prior to ovulation. That's actually what stimulates ovulation, so the release of the egg. And then following that, you have this increase in progesterone, which is the purple line. Just to give a bit more information on that, so you've got the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone are what interacts with the brain, and that's what triggers ovulation, or what causes the egg to mature in the first place prior to ovulation. And then it's the estrogen and progesterone that play a part in either maintaining and developing the uterus lining, or actually the decrease in progesterone is an indicator that actually that egg hasn't been fertilized, the female's not pregnant, and therefore that uterus lining is shed, and that's what causes a period. So that's all great from a scientific perspective, and obviously within my role I need to have a really good sound understanding of how that all works. But for me, when I'm working with athletes, is actually how does that interact with the person? So just to start off with, it's thinking about some of those symptoms. So actually a period might cause cramps and obviously the bleeding. This follicular phase, when you start getting this increase in estrogen, that can actually be a time when females feel really strong, really energized. So it might be really good to go for it training. But when you go into this luteal phase and you get this increase in progesterone, females can maybe feel more clumsy, have food cravings, decreased motivation, feeling more lethargic, maybe more irritable. And also other symptoms like gastrointestinal disturbance, maybe weight gain, bloating, and they might start feeling cramps then. So it's straight away actually going from the science to how do we apply this in sport, and how do those symptoms influence those female athletes. One thing I've put here is sometimes it's really important about how you communicate that message. So when I've just talked about the follicular phase and the luteal phase, sometimes that's just too scientific, and we need to break that down into something that's a bit more manageable to talk about. And I really liked this actually, that you can think about the 4 cycles and the 4 phases is like the 4 different phases in the year. So you've got spring, which is rebirth, which is when everything's growing, you feel really positive, which is when you've got that increase in estrogen. Summer, that's your ovulatory phase. Then you've got this decrease when your progesterone increases and you start feeling a bit flat. That's autumn. And then winter, shedding, that's when you have your period. So sometimes in some of the work I do, it's about being a little bit creative of how we maybe share those messages with the athletes I'm working with. And this is what it all comes down to. So what about the person? So how does that science apply to the person? And this is an example of Heather Watson that actually spoke out after a tennis match when she said she didn't perform well. She was really struggling because she had such bad menstrual cramps. And that was quite a shock in the media that she'd actually said it was related to her period. And it's definitely still something to highlight, that this is an area which is still commonly talked about or maybe supported within sports science, but it's definitely something that's emerging. And there's actually another example by Jasmine Sawyers when she talked about that period pain actually forced her to pull out of a competition. And just reading there what she said, I wasn't going to give an explanation online about why I pulled out of yesterday's competition, but this is something that isn't talked about enough in sport, and it ought to be. About an hour before I was supposed to leave for the track, I came on my period. I get very bad period pains for the first 1 to 2 days. I can't walk, it's an intense pain, radiating down my legs, head spinning, full body sweating, shouting, crying, kind of bad. 5 minutes before leaving for the track, all of the above happened. If you don't have periods or you don't have them bad, it's hard to imagine why I can't just suck it up and compete. But when you're in so much pain, you can't walk even a few steps and your legs buckle under your own weight, there's no chance you can jump. And for me, I put that example in because that really highlights why we're completing some of the work we are in sports science and supporting female athletes in the menstrual cycle. Because Jasmine might have considered every other aspect of performance, what she was eating, what her training program had been like, every detail, but actually had the menstrual cycle been considered. And it's actually really positive that it's now coming more into the open, and the research is starting to appear to be able to support female athletes and perform at their best. I just wanted to put a few examples in here so it wasn't just related to sport, to kind of highlight actually how females do experience the menstrual cycle and how it does affect them. So I've just got a few there around what it's like to have your first period. So actually it's so embarrassing, you've got white trousers on and you start your period. What's that like, again, relating it back to sport, to someone that's maybe competing in white? So female rugby players have to wear white shorts. Judo, you wear a white gi. So actually, is that a worry both within and out of sport? Another one there that from Kate Winslet, I like this one. I'm not going to say it's all happy clappy. There were days when you think, oh my God, I've got my period and I can't get in that freezing cold water today. I remember standing up and saying to everyone, listen, if it suddenly looks like Jaws, the movie, it's not my fault. It is my fault, sorry. So these conversations were actually really similar to some of the quotes and some of the conversations I had with female athletes. So when I started this work, and a big part of what I've done so far was actually interview 18 Welsh athletes to try and understand how the menstrual cycle impacted them, their perceptions of it and experiences of it. And I'm sure if there's anyone that either is an athlete or not an athlete, you can still relate to a lot of these symptoms. I know I certainly can. So you've got things like, my periods were definitely worse when I was a teenager. So that's great for us as sports scientists to be aware that it might be an area we need to focus on with youth developing females. The first day is always pretty grim. I just feel terrible. I feel a bit lousy, but once it comes, it's absolutely fine. Always that familiar feeling of I'd rather eat chocolate and watch TV on the sofa rather than go in training and trying to do a high intensity session, really pushing yourself. So there's loads of different quotes and conversations that I had, which were so insightful and have really driven the work that I've done and is being done within sports science as well. And to go into more detail, these are actually the list of symptoms that the Welsh female athletes reported. So you've got some there that might be quite common and a lot of people might already be aware of. Both males and females can probably either they've experienced it or they've observed other females experience those symptoms, such as pain and cramps, maybe being a bit more agitated, being a bit more moody. But the key thing with symptoms is it's so individual. So one female might report only one symptom that's really mild and quite manageable, whereas other females I spoke to could pretty much tick every single one of those symptoms to say at some point within those 4 phases of the menstrual cycle they experienced something in relation to those symptoms. And therefore, how is that impacting on their performance? To train, to compete, and like I said at the start, just to be managing their day-to-day life. Obviously, the example from Jasmine Sawyer described that day-to-day life coping with those cramps and pains is really hard, let alone trying to compete at the Olympics, as an example. So one of the key things for me is the management strategies. So if I want to help females perform at their best on any given day of their cycle, how do we help them do that? And one of the key areas that I've been working on is the monitoring and tracking of cycles. So by helping athletes to understand their menstrual cycle, understand their symptoms, increase their self-awareness, it also really helps them to identify what other management strategies they might need to use. And it's also really helpful then for the coach to understand what symptoms is experienced, to understand how you might maybe plan a training program in relation to those symptoms. So again, if an athlete only one day of the month has very mild cramps, not much training might need to be adjusted. Whereas for other female athletes, there might be a real consideration around how training looks in relation to their menstrual cycle. And there's some key other management strategies that we can then bring in, whether that's looking at a healthy, balanced diet. So we know that processed foods can actually heighten symptoms and make them feel a lot worse. So eating lots of fruit and veg, and through that getting the anti-inflammatories to reduce some of the symptoms associated with inflammation. Managing stress is a key one. So whether that's training stress, whether that's generally, I've put there, life stress, school, work, they're really key areas that might be impacting the menstrual cycle, might be making it more irregular or worsening some of the symptoms. So if you're really stressed and you are prone to maybe feeling a bit more irritated or agitated, then that's definitely stress is something that might make that symptom feel even worse. Sleep and recovery, that's key, especially for managing if you've got increased inflammation. And again, getting enough sleep so that you can manage that. So these are all things that we can look at with female athletes and that I work with when I'm working with female athletes as a sports scientist. I've actually put 2 specific examples there. So period pain, that's one of the most commonly reported symptoms, not just by female athletes, but females across the board. And we know that light exercise, so things like yoga, can really help. And also heat a hot water bottle. So there are things that are quite simple, easy strategies to use. So if a female athlete knows that they're going to really suffer from period pain, then they're able to actually maybe complete some lighter exercise or do some yoga to try and help manage that on the day of their cramps, so that then they can get back to training in that high intensity session maybe the next day. One of the key things though that I have highlighted with a lot of female athletes and coaches, and hopefully by going through those management strategies, it shows that we can be able to perform, we can manage those symptoms. And that's it, definitely, the menstrual cycle and periods shouldn't stop you. So one of my biggest examples there is Paula Radcliffe revealed she broke the marathon world record while suffering period cramps in the last third of her race. So although she was still suffering period cramps, she'd got used to training when she had those. She'd used painkillers to reduce it, so it was maybe more of a dull ache rather than some of the really intense pain that some females experience, and therefore was still able to perform at her very best and break a world record. So I've got on here now, this is actually an example of how I put together so how we might track and how we might integrate the menstrual cycle with training. So this was, so for example, what I did to start off with was have a conversation with this female athlete, understand what symptoms she experienced, what her perceptions were, and then we can then start looking at mapping that out across the whole cycle and how that relates to training. So first of all, if we start with day one, so the first day of bleeding, so we know you're going to have a 5-day period every month. That's really consistent, 5 days. The symptoms are always worse on day one, and that's cramps. So we know that you could use medication such as painkillers, some yoga, to be able to manage day one of those symptoms. Then it's like a period without any reported symptoms. You get this increase in estrogen, and it's reported she's feeling great, really strong, but the only thing at this stage is there's also potentially an increased risk of injury due to connective tissues becoming a little bit more lax. So you can have more movement within the joints. And that was actually something that was reoccurring. There was always kind of tendon pain around that time. So actually, what do we need to put in place between that time of the period and ovulation to make sure that athlete doesn't get injured, so they can still really push on if they're feeling great, do really, really good training sessions, but making sure they're not getting injured. So it's about being proactive and putting in like a prehab type program within that phase of the menstrual cycle. We've then got reports of sometimes feeling a little bit more lethargic or lacking motivation. So that's about having a conversation with the coach. How can the coach really help motivate the athlete? And also the sports psychologist working with the athlete, so they've got techniques of knowing how they can increase and manage their motivation levels. And at the same time around there, having food cravings and maybe feeling weak. So actually, how can the nutritionist support in that time, making sure that they're having the right food intake so they don't get those cravings, and also giving them the right energy so they feel strong, or they feel that they've got the ability to complete high intensity sessions. Then the athlete actually reported, although we know a risk of injury is more common earlier on, what I've already described, the athlete actually felt at greater risk of injury during this late phase. And that was also associated with feeling less coordinated and more clumsy. So that was something really to consider when doing skill work. What training do we do at that time? Is introducing a new skill at that time within the menstrual cycle the best time to bring that in, when maybe the athlete's been a bit more cautious or not having that best coordination and awareness? So you can see there that you've got different aspects that we've brought in across the menstrual cycle from the experience of the female athlete, and then looked at how we modify training so we make sure that they're able to train at their very best throughout any point within their cycle. And then I've put down in the bottom there that sometimes there's reports of increased worry and anxiety, being more emotional, and maybe a bit more restless. And that's only sometimes, because we worked out it actually coincided with stress levels. So that was something to be aware of, especially maybe in the lead up to competition, of being able to manage those symptoms, having an awareness of them. And again, what strategies can you use to manage your anxiety? What do you need to do so you don't feel so restless or be a bit less irritable? What do you need to do to look after yourself and be mindful of how you're feeling? So that's kind of the science behind it, but this is actually, I wanted to put this in because it's a big aspect of what this work has been around, is actually the communication and the conversations relating to it. So I said at the start, it's still not a topic, periods in the menstrual cycle, that some people are comfortable or happy talking about. And actually, if I hadn't have focused on conversations to start off with, those previous areas of work that I've implemented and worked on wouldn't have been possible. So this is actually some information that I share with coaches, by bringing menstruation out into the open, you're letting others know it's okay to discuss. So by the coaches bringing up the topic, female athletes automatically know that they're comfortable, they're happy talking about it, and it's actually a conversation that we can have and should be having. Properly naming and talking about the menstrual cycle, so there's so many different euphemisms that are used. But to me that, and this might be a personal opinion, but almost re-emphasizes that it's something secret, it's not something that we're comfortable talking about. So I was talking to the coaches about using the word period or menstrual cycle, and although it might be awkward to start off with, actually the more you say it, the more we talk about it, everyone starts feeling it just becomes part of the same as any other determinant of performance. So anything else that's influencing how they're training and competing, it just becomes another one of those factors. And I talked about the making sure the athlete having their self-awareness, but also the coaches to know your athlete and your athlete to have their own self-awareness. And then that can really help link and have the conversation. So you can share observations and experiences. So what is the coach observing? What is the female athlete experiencing? And then how can you manage training and competition when you relate the two together? And this kind of emphasise a little bit of why those conversations were so key and why that was one of my starting points. We know that half the girls ages 14 to 21 in the UK are embarrassed talking about their periods. 1 in 7 admitted that they didn't know what was happening when they started their period. So that's been a key area for me of actually looking at how do we work with younger female athletes and younger females in general so that they know what's happening when they start their period, how to manage that, and make sure it's not a reason to drop out of sport, so that they do hopefully progress through and achieve that Olympic level. Only 1 in 5 girls feel comfortable discussing their period, and almost 3/4 of girls admitted they felt embarrassed wearing menstrual products. And then that last one is half of girls have missed an entire day of school because of their period. So if they've missed school, they're likely also to have missed out sport and physical activity. So that's a reason why we've really started looking into this in more detail, and trying to support female athletes around their menstrual cycle. So these reported feelings and experiences are reduced. And I've put up there, that picture there is highlighting some of the key things that females reported, that actually if they're unfamiliar with the person they're talking to, or it's not a conversation they've previously had, then they feel the conversation's really awkward. Whereas if it's a conversation that's experienced a lot, they feel the person they're talking to they trust, and also how much so their experience of the menstrual cycle and conversations really impacted those conversations. And the other thing was the perception that males don't get it. That was quite a key thing that came out of it, the conversations I had with the female athletes. So we've started actioning that and making a change in sports science by providing coach education. That way coaches can gain more knowledge, more information about the menstrual cycle, how it impacts training and performance. But likewise, female athletes are then more comfortable and start changing that perception that actually my male coach does understand, they do have an awareness, so I can talk to them about it. And I've put up there actually, just to finish and to share with you, that Emma Barnett actually has written a book. It's called About Bloody Time, period. And actually there were some great quotes that I wanted to share with you out of there that really summarised maybe some of the general perceptions of the menstrual cycle, but also transfer over and have been so familiar in the work I've been doing in sports science. So if we don't start talking openly about the issues, these perceptions will go unchallenged for yet another generation. And actually one of the female athletes I spoke to said to me, I don't get why in 2020 no one still talks about periods. Girls are superheroes. Who else could bleed for a week and not die? I always like that one. And sometimes that's really useful to use when females are maybe experience really heavy periods or severe symptoms and things that they can't manage, and it gives them kind of just a bit of a different perspective on it. We can't continue as a human race without periods, and yet we still can't acknowledge their existence. And being period positive is a brilliant concept. You don't have to love your periods, but the way you talk about them should be positive and straightforward. And these are messages that, yes, are existing in day-to-day life, but are definitely transferring over into sport, and are definitely underpinning a lot of the work that I'm completing in sport and exercise science with female athletes. Perfect, that's me for today. So I think we're going to open up to any questions. Is that right, Adam?
That's right, yes. So we've had a couple that have come in already.
Okay.
Some will come in as we're talking as well, that I'll keep an eye on. But I've got a few questions I want to ask you as well. And it's really good. You spoke about coach education there, and especially the natural barrier that's presented by male coaches, for example. What sort of buy-in have you had, or have you heard of in your professional experience from male coaches to take this up, and any comments with that?
Yeah, it's been really interesting actually, and it's been quite mixed. So for example, I've done some workshops and male coaches have come along and have been really open, happy to talk about the menstrual cycle. And one thing that's actually been really interesting is when females have been in the room, of actually males starting to realise that actually females don't necessarily know that much more about the menstrual cycle. Although they experience it, they don't maybe know how it might interact with training, or even what symptoms you might experience. So it's definitely been mixed, but more and more I think male coaches are seeing it as being an important factor, and it has been around starting to create and shift that perception that it's not something we talk about. And I think the more it's in like the media, the more we talk about it, we offer coach education, hopefully it will start changing some of that perception.
Yeah, because it is, even in female sport, the majority of coaches are male. I saw that last year in America, the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport did an analysis of US college and university sports teams. And it was like only 41% of head coaches of female teams are actually female, and 49% of assistant coaches are female. And it was really prominent in the FIFA Women's World Cup last year as well. Only 9 of the 24 coaches were women, 15 were men. So there is this natural barrier. But you'd raised a really good point there, in that a lot of women don't know about the menstrual cycle. They don't know the biology of their own bodies to the depth of understanding and self-awareness.
Yeah, so for example, one of the questions I always say is how many hormones are involved in the menstrual cycle? And everyone's always like estrogen and progesterone, and actually no one's aware that you've got LH and FSH as well that interact with the brain, that actually cause and kind of either increase or decrease those other 2 hormones that everyone's aware of. And a lot of it comes down to as well that females, other than their own experiences, have also only ever received probably the same amount of education as males, and that's normally a little bit of biology in secondary school.
Yeah, we've had a question that touches on that. So Kate asked, do you think it should be compulsory for male coaches and female coaches to learn about periods instead of it being buy-in, or being prompted to buy in? And then you raise a really good point. The school system and the education system, and we learn about Pythagoras' theorem, but we don't learn about periods and the menstrual cycle. So should that be embedded in curriculum as well?
Yeah, so I mean, for me, and I might be biased because I'm working in this area, but if it became part of coach education, I think that's really important. More from if I look at it from a scientific perspective, that it is a hormone or endocrine system that's going to influence performance. So we consider how the cardiovascular system affects training, we consider how the respiratory system works in training. So actually, why is a hormonal system not considered? So from a complete scientific perspective, I'd say it should be included, but also then from a performance, more of a behavioural perspective of actually how females have to maybe deal with symptoms or how that interacts with training, that it could really influence training performance for some females. So for coaches to have an awareness of that, for me, I think is key. And it's actually been really positive to hear that a lot of coaches have been saying, I don't know why it's not been part of any of our coach education. So that's one of the reasons I've started working on that.
But that comment of buy-in is a really good example here today. So I was looking through a participant list of those that have joined us live, and there's only one man. So hello, Shane. But it's kind of a good example, naturally, that people see a topic on the menstrual cycle and periods of female athletes. It's not only for females to learn and know about this. So there is definitely that stigma. You've spoken about the media, obviously, and what we see in newspapers and on TV and in film. If you'd watched a long-running TV series, for example, you wouldn't know that women have periods, because if there's a group of women characters having a conversation like they would naturally, they don't talk about periods like what they would naturally in everyday life.
No, not at all. It is definitely still now something that's not maybe seen as an open conversation to have. I think it is starting to shift. There are a few more examples now within the media where females have kind of said, I didn't perform today, I was on my period, or like the other example I gave, I couldn't wear that dress to the BAFTA awards because I was going to be on my period. So people are starting, but for me, it's the fact that when they do talk about it, it makes such big media headlines, is almost emphasizes that it's still not a topic that we do talk about, because all of a sudden it's like it's a massive news story because someone said the word period on social media or on the broadcast.
Well, I'm watching, there's a really good program on BBC at the moment, I May Destroy You. And there was a scene where the woman was applying a sanitary pad explicitly and overtly there. And it's the first time I'd seen that on TV that I've noticed. And the fact that it is noticeable shows that, first of all, it is a big deal, but also shouldn't be a big deal at the same time as well. Yeah,
definitely. It's like, it's almost because we're not used to it that it's still like, that's unusual. But actually at the same time you go, well, why hasn't that, why is that something that's caused that response, and why is it something that we don't share? And I didn't touch on it too much actually, but some of the branding and companies that have actually kind of done the adverts for menstrual products haven't helped that. So it's always like, it's okay, this product will make sure no one knows you're on your period, and it's really discreet and you can hide it.
And then you have, happy, glowing looking women dancing around playing tennis, and it's not real life, is it?
Yeah. So that's obviously portrayed a different. So in the same time, a lot of females, I think, have received that message, and so feel that actually they're maybe not normal in comparison to that. So it's just something they have to deal with, something they experience individually, and they've just got to. A lot of the girls I spoke to kind of use the words that I've just got to suck it up, or I've just got to get on with it. And actually, we've been trying to change that a little bit to say, so many females experience symptoms, we can actually think about how we make this better or how we reduce them. There are options. You haven't just got to think, oh great, I'm gonna be at the Olympics the week before when I always feel rubbish, and I've just got to accept that.
We've had a lot of audience questions come in. A lot of them are physiology and biology related. So I want to begin with, how would you help athletes manage their training who don't have regular periods or don't necessarily have a pattern with their cycle?
Okay, so one of the key things there is actually to, first of all, identify what's making their periods irregular. And that would be one of the key things. So first of all is like I said at the start, having a regular period is a really vital sign of good health. So it's actually identifying what that is. So Is it stress that's causing that irregular period? Is it their energies maybe imbalanced, so they're not taking enough fuel in for their kind of energy expenditure? And then that's the key thing of then returning to having a regular cycle, and then you'll be able to manage what is a regular cycle then in relation to training.
Okay. And then what about athletes on the pill? So would it benefit athletes to manipulate their cycle so that they are, strongest when they are able to compete in terms of, the physiological responses and symptoms of the cycle?
Yeah, that's a good question. One that always comes up around contraception, which is almost like another topic in itself. For me, I think the research is still quite varied as to how taking contraception impacts on a long-term basis on training and the adaptation you get from training. And I suppose for me, I'd say it's a balance and it's a consideration. So you might equally have some positives if you have negatives. So the positives is you can potentially completely control your period so that you're not going to be maybe bleeding when you're at your competition. But on the flip side of that is managing, do you get any alternative symptoms by taking the contraceptive or using any form of contraceptive that you wouldn't naturally? So one thing that's talked about quite frequently is this kind of flatline feel when you take contraception. So because you're not having such fluctuations, you don't have the more moody, irritable side, but also you don't necessarily have that really high energy that you get when you get the increase in estrogen. And then the other thing with contraception is it can actually hide if you're having a regular cycle. So having a regular cycle is really important. Estrogen is also really important for bone health. And sometimes taking contraception, although you might still have a bleed, that's actually what we call a withdrawal bleed, not a period. So you don't actually necessarily know if you've still got that regular period to know if you're in a nice energy balanced state and having a good impact on bone health. So there's like a real kind of weighing scales for me on whether to take contraception or not as an athlete.
There's a question that relates back to when you were talking about methods to self-manage. So is there evidence for avoiding processed foods isolated only to the time of menstruation?
I honestly wouldn't like to say if it's specific. From my knowledge, it's been across the board because it interacts so much, and your symptoms don't always just come when you're bleeding. So for some females, that might be from ovulation up to day one of bleeding, they experience symptoms. So there's an interaction throughout that time. And it's actually the association with the inflammation and how that interacts with symptoms. So actually for me, like processed foods across the cycle might have an influence. And obviously it's always good just to be really mindful of fruit and veg intake, not just for the menstrual cycle, but it does play a big impact.
Good. We got a question from Shane. So could you comment on the level of scientific evidence for menstrual cycle training periodization and where the future research could focus, and if you've got any plans for, progressing your own research work?
Yeah, definitely. So right now, I feel like the research is really split as to whether you should periodize training based on the menstrual cycle. I've obviously touched on that you might consider different training during different times of the cycle, and that's mainly for how symptoms interact. But regarding the whole periodization of it, there's some evidence and some research that's supporting that actually, yes, you could periodize it. And there's also been practical examples of when I've worked with people that they've done that and had a positive impact. But likewise, there's also other research that's shown it's having no impact. From what I'm aware of research I've read recently, is probably the one comment to have is there's no research that's currently saying it would have a negative impact in that. But I do think it is still an area that's still developing and still quite new. So even some of the research that is out there, maybe it's not the strongest. So actually that was a really good kind of expert statement that's bases are releasing that researchers have put together of how we collect, do data collection with females at different phases of the menstrual cycle, because previously some of the research might be based on just counting the number of days. Well, actually that's going on the assumption that every female maybe has ovulation at like halfway through their cycle. So actually you then may have tested a female that you're saying is in their luteal phase, but they're actually still in their follicular phase when they've still got a higher estrogen level. So I think there's still so much work to be done on that, which is probably one of the areas that would for me be looking to go into, and maybe looking at individual responses to training sessions. So actually to different types of training sessions, is there an influence of the menstrual cycle? There's so many areas to look into. I'm not going to start going into detail of where I want my research to go.
But it's because there's so many challenges, they present so many opportunities to investigate and research, because there isn't a one size fits all output when it comes to periods and the menstrual cycle.
Definitely.
One size fits all approach.
Yeah, because one of the key things I've learned from having the conversations without even going into doing any physiological testing is actually how much variability there was between each individual. So if I was to look at training prescription, it would be still based on maybe having those conversations, then add in the physiological testing to map the two, to then look at how you might look at a training plan for that individual based on what their experiences are and what their physiology is doing.
There's a question that's a bit of a follow-up to what you were saying there. So do you think if research is done into how the female body reacts to different training types and schedules, the training programs could allow them to reach a point of equivalent athleticism to men? So that's quite a bold drop at the end there, where their equivalency is possible, but certainly working towards equivalency and potentially getting there. Is it possible when you do look at how the female body reacts at different points in the cycle?
I think it definitely could be something that does have an impact, because if we think about the performances from females that we've already seen and how they've progressed and developed over even like up to kind of now in the present day, and that's in a lot of cases maybe without considering the menstrual cycle. Actually, if we do add that in and really consider it and think about how it does interact with training, competition, adaptation, actually is there scope to continue to increase what females can achieve in sport?
Another question, there's evidence that strength is not affected regardless of the phase. However, agility and endurance are, especially mid-luteal phase. How do you alter female training around these? I think we're talking about more and more specific training and types and responses then, aren't we?
Yeah, definitely. I think, so it's around that specific, looking at the differences. And I'd also add into that, though, there is evidence for and against whether strength training is better at some stages of the menstrual cycle than others. So actually there is some evidence that suggests it would be better to do it within the follicular phase pre-ovulation. So it's still so mixed as to how you do it. And also thinking about agility training and strength training, the differences in your kind of glycogen to fat utilization. So there is a shift between what fuel you use, either within like the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So actually, how does that impact on maybe the types of sessions you want to do? But likewise, adding in, so say you are more predominant fat utilization in the luteal phase, actually how can we then use nutrition so you can still achieve those high intensity sessions, not just focus on endurance sessions, if that fits within the plan?
Even with the good work that you were doing and your colleagues and the field as a whole, it's still such an under-researched area, isn't it? And what are your hopes for that, and where do you want it to go?
Yeah, it's great that there is a lot more research being done, and it's also really nice that I think there's definitely areas of collaboration on that. So there's definitely almost this approach of there's not a lot of research done in female athletes. There's so many areas we could cover. how do we almost like work together on this so that we do cover those different areas. Because like I said, we haven't really touched on contraception today, and that could be a lifetime of work in itself. So for me, it's kind of looking at the research in probably split into like two different areas really, of A, an elite performance side of things, and then B, more of a developing youth athlete. So how does the menstrual cycle influence and affect a developing athlete? And does training response look very different for that developing athlete compared to a female that's maybe, their cycle is regular? So we know, from when you start your period, maybe the first 2 to 3 years can be really irregular. So actually, how does that influence response to training when you're a lot younger compared to when you've got hopefully a nice regular period of manageable symptoms?
And this, of course, is one cog in the big machine. So yes, this is physiology, but then there are other scientists and practitioners that can add value to the application of all this work, whether it's social scientists and policymakers and, whatever it may be across the board. So that collaboration, do you see it happening already, or is there?
Yeah, it's definitely, if I just take Sport Wales as a starting point from where I'm working, I'm working with a sports science team there. So you've kind of got your S&C, you've got your psychologists, you've got your nutritionists that are all aware and kind of contributing as well to this and thinking about how it might affect female athletes, what we need to look into. But also, like you said, on a wider scale, actually, grassroots, how does that affect policy? A lot broader sense. And you've got the different areas across sport, from participation to elite sport, of how we can collaborate and work together. And there's definitely findings that I've got from elite sport that when I'm working with doing coach education on that I equally think there's nothing I'm talking about now that wouldn't be applicable to a club that's kind of just trying to increase participation numbers and keep females involved in the sport.
Well, we've got a lot of people viewing this that are about to enter this world of sport and exercise science, entering their bachelor's degree potentially. What sort of advice would you give them, having gone through it yourself and now working in elite sport and around this research field? What advice would you give to them going in if they do want to go and focus on female athletes in the menstrual cycle, for example?
Yeah, I think it's one of the key things, I suppose, is when I started, and probably not even until a couple of years ago would I have known what my research area was that I was going to focus on. But if that is an area that you want to focus on, being really proactive of speaking to lecturers as to who's doing work in that, how can they help out, how can they get involved. Obviously, as you go through your undergraduate degree, then thinking about that third year dissertation, is there something you can be involved with for that? I know that I did my internship whilst I think I started my internship with Sport Wales as a physiologist in my second year. So again, looking out for those opportunities. So I was then kind of more exposed and having more experience of what it was like working in elite sport, and how these areas of interest could apply within that. And that definitely helped me develop and learn how the different components of it. So it definitely helps that transition from thinking of it from a science perspective and a sport perspective to how you then apply that in practice.
Great. We've got no more questions, that's all we've got time for.
Perfect.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much for, first of all, that really in-depth knowledge and about the science and the physiology behind the menstrual cycle. But obviously then the wider conversation about the other factors that influence female athletes and the world of sport ultimately. So thank you so much, Natalie, for all of your time. Thank you to everyone who's joined us live and or viewing afterwards as well. And have a good day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me, Adam.
No worries. See you soon.